I almost said good morning, but I realized I missed that by about 4 hours. Good afternoon, and it's good morning somewhere. It's almost drinks time somewhere. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining this session. This is Future-Proofing IAM. And I'd love to say we're all going to tell you how to future-proof your IAM, but I don't think we know how to. So it's really going to be more of a conversation about what the strategies and techniques are. So I'm moderating the panel. I'm Chris Misra. I'm the Vice Chancellor for IT and CIO at UMass Amherst. I'm going to just have the folks introduce themselves here, and then we'll just start going through questions. And I'm intending to keep this conversational and take questions from the audience as well. So, Kim?
Hi, I'm Kim Milford. I'm the CISO and Deputy CIO at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. I am not a CIO. I am not Mairead Martin. I'm sorry. Mairead is awesome, but she wasn't feeling well, so I'm stepping in. I'll try to answer your questions, and if I can't, my identity management experts are up there. So they will give me, they'll motion to me or, help me in some way.
Hi, I'm Lois Brooks. I'm the CIO at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I would just add to Kim's comments that it is somewhat intimidating to talk about identity in front of a group of people who know much, much more about identity than I do. But we'll give it a shot.
Hi, I'm Chris Sedore. I'm the Vice President and Chief Information Officer at Tufts University. As far as I know, I don't have any identity people here, so I can say whatever I want, so it's all good.
Great, thanks. So I was just going to start asking questions again. I'll encourage questions from the audience once we get going. But Kim, I'd start with you. Can you give an example of what you'd say is maybe the most pressing challenge or project in identity and access management from your CIO CISO role? So what, if you were to pick something that's really at it, challenges with the IAM platforms or systems?
I'm going to not talk about challenges with the platforms or systems and talk about money and organization. Great. So that is kind of our pressing issue right now. We have funding from many different sources, and looking at that and figuring out future-proofing that funding source is a big role that I have as we move forward. Identity, a little bit goes on here, and a little bit goes on here, and a little bit goes on here. So how do we bring that together? We do have a project on identity governance that is starting to tackle that. But I don't have, so next year maybe I can come and tell you our success stories on that.
Great. Lois, do you have sort of high-level challenges or things that you're thinking of? Again, if the concept of this session is future-proofing, we have to think not only about what we're doing now, but how we're going to mediate those same problems in the future. So.
The issue I worry about is less about money. I think we can solve for that. The issue that I'm more concerned about is that all roads lead to identity. We're doing a lot of work with Zero Trust. We're doing a big administrative transformation. We're doing academic transformations, and everything lands on the identity team. And we've got the expertise, but the capacity to grow and to handle all the new things coming at us is really quite a challenge. And as we think about how much is changing around us, just the cybersecurity space, for example, it's going to take constant evolution, constant retooling to stay up with it. And so I worry a lot about the human sustainability aspect more than the money sustainability.
Great, thanks. Chris, same question for you.
Yeah, so maybe I'll have a little fun with this. So I'll just go to the typical higher ed challenge, which is complexity around identities. And I recently went to our med school, and they explained to me that they're reclassifying how they talk about their faculty. So we used to have clinical faculty, regular faculty, all sorts of faculty. They let me know that they just want to talk about them as faculty. And I said, well, so let's talk about what we used to call affiliates. They said, we don't use the A word anymore. I said, okay, what do you call them? We call them unemployed faculty. I'm like, do they know we call them that? Because of course in medical schools they often work for healthcare entities. So, but what we're finding is that we've always had this challenge associated with the many relationships, and in often cases multiple relationships that people have with our institutions. But something that I didn't really believe was going to get more complicated is just getting more complicated with time in terms of partnerships, relationships, and the number of distinctions we want to make around those kinds of identities to security and other dimensions of what we're trying to manage.
Great, thanks. I want to pivot a little bit on this, and I think it comes down to, Chris, what you were leaning into. and I'll start with Kim again. Could you talk about what you've seen from changing campus expectations with respect to identity? And what I mean by that is, historically, identity was, just make sure people can mostly log in, but the expectations have changed fundamentally. Could you talk about what you're seeing from your CISO role of that change in expectation, again, with the intent of how are we going to hedge in the future states where we're going to find ourselves?
Certainly, what Lois and Chris both alluded to, the fundamental nature of identity management, that's being relied on more and more as a control in Zero Trust, as how we accomplish privacy and data management. So we see that developing and moving forward with that complexity that Chris talked about. I kind of lost my train of thought. Remind me?
Campus expectation changes.
Oh, right. So that's a big piece of it. And then the other thing is access immediately, 100%, all the access. I don't want to wait on this access to this system or that system, and access across the university systems and with our partners, so outside of our internal borders, our internal net IDs.
So Lois, one thing I want to follow up with you on this, again, with the expectations. You talked a little bit about the staffing. Could you talk about sort of how you're thinking about staffing IAM operations in the future? Because I think things are changing, right? A lot of us came from an organization where we built homegrown software, we used ITAP components. I'm feeling, at least my own institution, a change in that dynamic. Not that those tools are not important, but the expectations are different, and staffing needs are hard in this space. Could you talk about how you're approaching that from an institutional perspective?
I think that it's not unique to identity, but what we've seen over the last 5 years, certainly maybe a little bit longer, and I want to be careful because we still hire technologists and engineers, but what we need much more of are architects that are really helping us think about, the 15-year problem of how these solutions fit together, people with user design experience, so it can really help us think through what the users need and how we translate that to technology, people who can run service operations. So what we're seeing, the difference in staffing, I think, is really expanding the skill set to much beyond the engineering space. And I will add to this, as an employer, we're really challenged. We've got to figure out ways how to keep the best staff, to make the workplace attractive, to make the workload interesting and bearable, to make us be an employer of choice. And so a lot of what we're thinking about with staffing are not the kinds of positions we hire, but how we can be a place where each person can bring their best selves, do their best work, and want to stay and do really innovative and interesting work for us. So a lot of what I'm thinking about are really kind of the organizational excellence aspects from the employee perspective. And I have no idea if that went where you wanted me to go, Chris, but that's what's on my mind.
That's great. That's less scripting and more talking. So, Chris, I'll ask you, do you see any difference with respect to staffing? The three of us represent large R1 public institutions. Tufts has a very large research portfolio. Is there a difference being at a private school versus a public school for any of the staffing from a compensation talent perspective, or do you think there's not a real difference there?
I would say it seems all hard to me, regardless of context. And I'll echo what Lois said, that recruiting and retaining the best people is a constant challenge. It's a challenge on the comp side. It's a challenge on keeping them with interesting work. So no, I don't really think it is that difference. We have differences in how we're funded and where the revenue comes from, but net, I don't think the differences are significant.
Great. So let me follow up on that. I'll stay with Chris just to not go clearly linear. Have you had to change beyond the staffing your resource allocation around identity and access management? Is it taking up more of your budget? Is it more prevalent? Is there more downstream business dependencies? Can you talk about changes you've seen in the past couple of years? And again, I'm really trying to figure out where things are going collectively.
Sure. So we definitely have moved resources toward identity, I think, in two ways. One is what I might think of as kind of core identity, additional investments there. But also, as I think Kim referenced, there's more dependent on identity. And so our need to actually do a better job of integrating systems from an identity perspective, and also I would say expansion in identity. And this has been interesting to me in the journey here of when we talk about identity, I learned recently that there's sort of a canon of what identity management is when we talk about it in IT. I wasn't familiar with that canon, so things like common name or preferred name, pronouns, et cetera, to me, that's all part of identity. That's part of what my campus expects us to count as identity. So we've had to add resources and capacity to address those things in addition to the traditional accounts and, access rights and all those kinds of things that we manage.
Great. So Lois, I'll ask you the same thing, sort of riffing off what Chris was talking about. I came up through the identity group, and I tend to think in this sort of canon view of I'm going to have an SOR, and I'm going to have my LDAP and my Kerberos, and but the general cognition of identity is much broader. It's about role. It's about affiliation. Can you talk about how you're thinking at your institution of this broader definition of identity, of incorporating these larger attributes in both service delivery, but also how people see themselves, even going down to given name, presented name, dealing with, non-binary gender identities. How have you been thinking about that in Wisconsin?
This has actually been a big area of focus for us, but I would pull it back even a little more, Chris, to say we think we have a really interesting advantage in IT, and that we see across the entire university. We see all the business offices, and we understand, if we choose to understand, and I think we do choose, what the user experience can be. So we're thinking, about things like name and use, about pronouns, all of those kinds of things, but we're also thinking even more broadly about what is this student's experience. A person may have a multiple identity with the university. They may be an alum and an employee, they may be a current student and an employee, they may volunteer. They've got these multiple identities and multiple relationships with different business offices, and we're often the only ones who see that and know that. And so we have this really interesting opportunity ahead of us to really think about the user experience and how we can use what we do with identity to mask complexity and add elegance to the user experience. Something as simple as having your name and use propagate out to applications so it looks like applications know you already, to provide this level of personalization, but to also help us understand much more about the overall user experience and how we can improve that for people, and then act as the advocate for the faculty and students who are our customers, act as their advocate back to some of the business offices to help them understand how all of this can come together into a cohesive experience. We're doing a lot of work in our identity space, adding some tooling in, Salesforce in our case, and some other tools that allow us to do some of this kind of future-looking user experience work. And I think that's actually one of the most important things we can be doing as an institution, beyond the much-needed and standard kind of security and roles work that we all do.
Great, thanks. Kim, I want to ask a question that really leverages some of your CISO experience. I know one of the pain points we have at UMass is a lot of our identity management infrastructure is still built on outdated systems. Thankfully, no longer unsupported operating systems. We solved that a couple of years ago. But there's a lot of legacy code, legacy platforms. Could you talk both from an identity perspective, but also a security perspective, how you're thinking about that at your institution and how we're managing problems like that? Because my observation is that a lot of us built these platforms, depend on these platforms, but kind of don't want to remember we have to keep investing in these platforms because they're working.
Yeah, and that's key. They're working, and I'll go back to what Lois was talking about the importance of keeping good staff, right? That I have a great team devoted to this who stay very current with the trends and the technologies and the vulnerabilities, and so I rely on them greatly with that. And then identity is part of my team. So we have identity, privacy, and cybersecurity all together. It's a fairly new construct, so I can't say that, oh, it's working great. We have these co-meetings all the time. We're getting there, and it's more just because we're learning our way, not because of they're not committed and I'm not committed. It's just taking us a while to figure that out. But I think that cohesiveness in view, that we're all part of the same both puzzle and solution, leads us to better outcomes for the university.
Great, thanks. So sticking on the sort of systems theme, Chris, I wanted to jump to you because you and I had this sidebar conversation a couple of weeks ago. One of the things I think we've seen aside from the outdated systems is this notion of sort of bloat around identity management systems. We keep writing code, we keep doing things, we implement bespoke applications. Can you talk about how you're approaching that at Tufts, looking at these sort of add-on functions that were maybe a creative problem to solve a one-time, end up becoming core infrastructure? How are you approaching that at Tufts?
So I think in a variety of ways we're In part, I think we're actually making the problem worse as we're busily adding specialized, kind of point solutions to things. We're also trying, as I think was referenced already, to look forward at architecture here to understand what are the sort of elegant long-term solutions to the problems that we face. And I think we're constrained there by, frankly, I mentioned complexity earlier. We have complexity that many of the vended solutions don't really respond well to. That's a challenge for us. And I think we also have challenges in the context of the nature of systems. That, the bane of our existence is systems which believe that your email address is your forever unique identifier, which isn't a thing. And so I think that these kinds of challenges provide real constraints and lead to these kind of point corrective solutions or this glue that we build to address those issues. I'm hoping maybe someone else will have a better answer to the question because I haven't figured it out yet.
I would, if somebody in the audience want to try to answer that one? I would love, you'd probably make a lot of money consulting if you did. I think you're stuck, Chris.
I'm stuck.
Sorry.
Well, story of my life, yeah.
And so I want to follow up a little bit to the point you're raising, and Lois, I'll ask you, and this is probably an unfair question, but to what Chris was just getting at, given these bespoke solutions, the internal solutions we've looked at, the vendor marketplace is changing. Many of us have moved a lot of our core identities, authentication workflows to Microsoft or to Google. Has that changed how you're thinking about the identity management architectures in Wisconsin? Has that, informed where you see a future? Are you going to be deeply in the identity business? Are you going to, what is core to your business? What is vendable out?
It's almost an unanswerable question, Chris. The identity platform isn't one thing. It's a whole suite of tools working together, doing a lot of different functions in this massively, massively complex environment at UW-Madison. The way we're thinking about it, we've got some tooling, things like Active Directory, that have been in our portfolio for a very long time and that we rely on, and we're constantly evolving and shifting the portfolio, not in a willy-nilly way, but in a very intentional and purposeful way, adding, for example, Salesforce into the portfolio because it does some things well. I'll give a question for the Wisconsin team here, John and Tom. Have we ever actually deprecated anything? Shout it out if it comes to you. We had talked about deprecating some tooling out, but untangling it and getting all the way to deprecation is so incredibly hard to do. But I think we are thinking a lot more about how can we move to a platform approach, having common platforms that people can use. How do we really more elegantly bind things through interoperability to take out some of the fragility of the systems? And so thinking about how we can evolve the platform in a way that is much less about maintenance and much more about innovation and service to the university. Did you think of anything we deprecated? Kerberos.
We got 98% done with Kerberos, and we're still running one server because there's some stupid radius server from stupid router that still needs it.
How do you really feel about that, Chris?
As the one who installed Kerberos as an undergraduate, almost sad, right? Because I graduated a really long time ago. I want to pivot a little bit on this, and so thank you, Lois, again for. I keep giving you the unfair question, so why don't I hit Chris with an unfair question?
Oh boy.
I'll pick on my friend Jack Seuss here. 350 applications in the class, SaaS applications, like cloud applications that need identity seem like a ticket a day, 4 tickets a day, and the delivery time is always 3 days ago would have been great, tomorrow's too late. How have you changed the workflows in your own unit and your own teams to accommodate this like really heavy demand cycle, this really short expectation cycle for new applications onboarding, in some cases which believe that your email address is your identity?
Yeah, that's a great question. And from my perspective, not really so much an identity problem, but a generalized business problem, right? And what we're seeing is hyper-specialization in SaaS offerings. And so I think that what we're really working to do now with our business units and our academic units is go through a purchase review process. So we're trying to go all the way back to business review and then roll them forward through that process. And that's because in addition to the identity elements of that, there are other data integration, security, there's a whole set of things that come into play associated with it. So we'll just get good dividends out of that process generally, I think.
Great. So Kim, I'm going to jump to you on a sort of same theme there, and it will probably be less unfair, I hope. But as a CISO, when you see these applications come on, whether or not you have a procurement review process, how is your institution thinking about which data you feel comfortable handing out to vendors with contractual controls versus which data you're like, you know what, we really need to keep that, whether it's on-prem or under our direct control? Are you vetting and assessing those data elements, especially with respect to identity and cloud integrations from a security perspective?
In general, yes, we vet it, we do a risk assessment, a cybersecurity risk assessment, and then a privacy impact assessment. So we have a lot of knowledge going in, and we have our procurement processes are strong. We have a good procurement department. So their process for how to take that and build it into the language of the contract or look for mitigating solutions is fairly strong. I saw it recently with a vendor product where they were, we were sort of interpreting GDPR in different ways. And we're going to come across that more and more with the international privacy laws. So, we said, well, we could do this instead of this. So we looked at several mitigations. We said, could you change the language? So we try it. We don't, the process still feels soft because we're just figuring it out. And every case is different. Every vendor reacts in a different way. Some of them are more than willing to talk about their agreement, and other ones are like, nope, you get what you see, that's it. So I don't have a one-size-fits-all. Nick Lewis and I were talking before the session, I don't know if he's in here, but we were talking about, vendor management, looking at it from a security assessment perspective is just one little piece, and it's so much broader than that, and this goes to that issue.
Great. So Lois, I'll ask you the same question, but in your lens as a CIO, and I've been a CISO in the CIO role, and the questions you get asked are different. The answers you can provide are often different. How do you see that as you see requests from your peers, from provosts, other vice chancellors, vice presidents, deans, with respect to this sort of quick delivery and security controls? How are you approaching that from a CIO perspective?
It's a tough question. First, I would say that our bigger problems of late have been third-party breaches. Not internal, and we do all the right things, right? We vet the software, we get contractual agreements in place, and none of that really matters when you're trying to explain to your own constituency, your donors, your alums, your students, why something just happened at the National Student Clearinghouse or what have you. Right? We do what we can the right way. Within the university, there's actually a pretty interesting and challenging balance because cybersecurity impedes academic progress. It makes research harder, it makes teaching and learning harder, it makes business operations harder because there are more steps people have to go through. And so we're absolutely going to cybersecure the university. And so much of what we think about and talk about is, again, how can we mask that complexity? How can we help people understand why they have to do what they have to do, but then how can we make it as easy on them as possible? It's not in the identity space, but something as simple, it wasn't simple to do, but as simple as having secured research storage that they can just use rather than having to vet every storage solution they want to bring together. So we're really thinking about how can we use our capabilities in the IT world to try to smooth and mask some of these complexities for other people. And then with university leadership, I need to do risk briefings, I need to do risk assessments with them, help them understand and weigh in on where we may need to make some choices to accept some risk, because if we don't accept risk on the security side, we're going to introduce risk on the business or academic side of the house. People won't be able to get their work done. And so that's a lot of what I end up doing, is having to help navigate. I think about it as kind of the top of the mountain, that you don't want to fall off on either side down the mountain into not enough security or not enough research happening, but to kind of navigate that top line and stay up there.
So Chris, I want to follow up with you on this as well. Sort of, I like the way Lois introduced the risk topic. Could you talk about how, for on-ramping applications, consuming identity services, do you do risk profiling of the application based on the user, or is it based on the data? So are you going to use a different bar when you're assessing a research use case? You land a large NSF project, you have to do this thing, it's a virtual organization, you need multi-identities. Are you using the same evaluative processes depending on the nature of the use case that's coming in?
So that's an interesting question. I would say we use, using the examples that you gave of kind of lenses, we actually try to evaluate it from each of the angles you described. So yes, it depends on what data is going in there. Yes, it depends on who's using it, right? So if we have a HIPAA-protected entity, we have a different set of standards we apply to it. So pretty much all of those things go into that. And I think from an identity perspective, and I'll add, we have things like, well, is this something that we have an export control obligation associated with? So we have to restrict this based on, citizenship or country of residency or those sorts of things. So I think that there are all of these dimensions that we have to explore and understand. And some of that complexity I referenced before is, historically, we didn't need to know whether you were a U.S. citizen in our identity system or not, or whether you were from an OFAC country or any of the rest of the things. Now we actually need to have that information available, and we have to actually make authorization decisions based on that.
Great. This was intended to be discussion, and I can talk for hours. I'd welcome questions from the audience, though, because I have plenty of questions, and I'm thrilled to have 3 really smart people up here. But can I ask questions from the audience that want to pose to the panel?
And feel free to direct your questions to Chris as well.
Absolutely.
And feel free to give better answers to the questions than I just gave.
And as I've taught undergraduates for 22 years, I am not ashamed to call names.
Although, with the lights on, I really can't
It's
see
hard,
anything.
yeah, I can't see. It's much easier when they're right there in front of you. There we go.
For the next 5 years, what is the trend or topic that you're most looking forward to? And what is the biggest, possibly second biggest, don't think too hard about it, but what is a high-profile risk or threat that keeps you preoccupied?
Sure. Oh, I'll take this one, and then I'll get the rest of you guys. So the biggest trend that interests me right now is not having to do all of this ourselves. It is really looking at how can we stitch reasonable vendor solutions together with products and components that we need to deliver services, quite frankly, because there's other problems I need to be focused on. I need to bring more resources to HPC and the like. So I think we're seeing a big inflection in the market. I think the market is pivoting. I'm not sure we're all ready for it, but that's exciting to me because there aren't clear deployment patterns everywhere. It is changing. That market's moving a lot. One of the big concerns I have is the same concern I have in other domains, that identity space, if it becomes hedged by just 3 major providers, and all of us have social identities and most of those 3 major providers, where does that leave us? And what is that going to look like from a cost perspective? That's a big risk for us. It's the same as a storage risk, it's the same as a data risk, but the identity is that persistent component. Like I can generally do without my data, can't do without my identity. That's a big issue for me, the way I'm looking at it. Kim.
So I'm from a threat assessment, cybersecurity threat assessment background. I'm going to answer from that perspective, right? Identities are achieved the highest way that people are now getting in and compromising our systems, 100%. Vulnerability is still very high, but identities are higher. And so they just have to compromise one. And I'm sure you've seen the diagrams of like, oh, and they got in here and they use these tools to go to these systems. That happens every single day because one person trusted a very good, sophisticated phishing scheme. Or it's usually phishing, but there are other ways they can get in too. So those identities are very, very, I don't know what you call it. I don't know what the right, weak. That's not the right word. Sorry, anyone else can help me? They're very attractive to criminals and bad actors. So they're going to keep trying to find ways to keep coming in, and we're going to keep trying to find ways to protect them. Multi-factor authentication is a really good, strong control for now, but we know it's just a matter of time until it's compromised too. Sorry, that was kind of the bummer answer.
That's why nobody invites security people to the party.
Well, I will say I completely agree, Kim, but my head went in a completely different direction with that question. Coming at us in the next 5 years, it's all AI. The promise and the peril how do we secure these systems? How do we harness the systems? How do we stay up with the innovation in the marketplace? But what can it do for us? What can we do with AI that helps us really drive greater insights that lead to better tooling, that lead to better service models for our employees, that frankly just take some of the manual work off of our employees? I think that there's a lot in front of us that we're going to be able to do, and it's very early days in the AI world. So, every day we're thinking about, I call it the possibility and the peril, how we navigate both possibility and peril in the AI world.
Yeah, and I actually might like to build on that, because when we started exploring some AI applications we'd like to build out, one of the first questions we ran into was authorization. And so now I need to know, well, do I need to split the authorization for Chris and Chris Bot, right? So that those are different authorizations. So I can grant my agent, my AI agent, which I hope to have very soon, since that maybe could do some of my work for me. But that's probably a different set of authorizations that I'm going to give the human Chris. I'm not sure which is going to come out better, but for now, I'd just be happy if I could separate them. And I think this is something as we look at what these options and opportunities are, and it goes at some of the threat modeling as well, because not only will people try to compromise the human Chris identity, but it will try to take advantage of machine Chris identities in the same sort of fashion. And so we want to be thoughtful about what those authorizations will look like.
Great, thanks. Other questions? Jack, I would have called on you anyways.
So the first question I have, because Lois, you mentioned the keywords, but I'm sort of curious where it's going, is it really seems Zero Trust is a place where we can be making a difference for cybersecurity, but it's fundamentally dependent upon an identity infrastructure that's very nimble and very quick. And so I'm sort of curious how each of you are sort of thinking about that, or if you have any thoughts about how you or we can be starting to make progress on Zero Trust as we think about this in our identity suites.
So we are on a Zero Trust path, and I don't know if this answers your question, Jack, but by the way, I would say we've branded Zero Trust at our university. We've branded it Smart Access because the words Zero Trust aren't ones that are helpful for us to use when talking to our faculty and students. Yeah. But we've actually broken it down into kind of some manageable chunks. And so a manageable chunk may be looking at how we deal with the identity space, or getting the right software on the right devices, so there will be a point where we can then trust them or not trust them more elegantly or thoroughly than we do now. What we've prioritized in this space are device management and some kind of retooling of some Active Directory things that we needed to do at the university to consolidate that environment. One of the interesting pieces of this Zero Trust journey has been trying to navigate the vendor community to find out what they really mean by this, and what pieces are useful or helpful to us within that. I don't know if that even began to answer your question, but a lot of it for us is kind of breaking it down to what do we do first.
It was helpful. I will say that I was sort of stymied because it's a lot of talk, but it was hard to put it into practice until I had recently, I think it was about 4 months ago, CISA came out with a really nice document on a zero trust architecture planning that I thought was really helpful in sort of thinking about that and trying to be building risk in, like, you're coming from overseas. Maybe we require MFA always, for every access that you're going to be making or something like that. I think trying to get the community to wrap its head around best practices in this could really help the community advance in a nice way.
I fully agree, and I'll give a plug also. The engagement with CISA recently we've had within Massachusetts and New England has been fantastic. I don't know who figured out what in DHS, but they have put a program together, high quality documents, and so if you haven't engaged with them, look at them. They're doing good content. I've had the exact same experience in fields like identity, but even in like E911 fields, they've been a huge resource for us.
So I have two related questions that'll come into this, and it's about, as we think about, and it's sort of asking where do we go as a community in the IAM space. But one of the things that I have as one of the pieces that I think we should be trying to figure out is how do we build accessibility profiles into our identity suites? The reality is that every web-based application I go to, it should just be able, if I've given it an accessibility profile, it should be able to be consuming that. Much like we, sort of set up the original sort of, okay, you'll have the basic payload that can be here. Can we be thinking about that as something that maybe we want to be trying to be moving towards? And I'm sort of saying this in the context of not that you all are doing it, but what are the questions we need to be asking the In Common Futures group to be, and a couple of you are on, are all of you on In Common steering?
I think just me.
Just you, okay.
Oh, yeah, you too. Okay, you are.
Yeah, so how do we get the groups thinking about that? And when I said accessibility, you could say the same thing about AI, because AI is going to be about personalization as well at some point in time. And these profiles could potentially be part of our identity if we wanted to be making it so.
Yeah.
And I might just extend it, because one of the issues for us is in the physical accessibility realm of many of our physical accessibility devices are card access controlled. And so we want to be able to provision based on that. So that's yet another set of attributes that need to be available in the identity system so that we can provision access appropriately. And I think it ties, and I'll tie back to your earlier question, there's some architectural primitives. So near real time for everything, because we can't wait a day for feeds to run overnight or whatever the case may be. And also this notion of identity as a first-class system. So, my experience with identity historically is that identity's job is to go and collect everything from a whole myriad of systems and somehow figure out how to distill that into the version of you that matters. And the reality is that we can't really work that way anymore. And so we're working toward making identity the system of record for people. And we will actually keep certain attributes of people in that system and feed other systems, including HR and other things that historically have been viewed as the systems of record for those attributes. So I think that there are elements of that when you start to decompose this that points you in the direction of being able to solve these problems kind of architecturally.
And I'll agree with Chris on that one, that I think I like that label of identity as a first-rate system, right? Like, we all spend piles of money on an HR system. We all spend piles of money on a finance system. We all spend piles of money on a student system. And we log in with an identity system that we probably haven't spent nearly that scale of money on, but all those systems are driven out of that. So whether it's accessibility, any attribute, I think as a community, and I'll say this as a CIO, but I think it's also true with the internet too, we have to start thinking these platforms at that tier. Maybe not necessarily that scale of investment, but at a scale of investment much beyond what we've been doing from an institutional perspective, because the dependence is far greater, in my perspective, than the resources we've allocated to it. Right? We've allocated the resources to run it, but not to drive the entirety of our business. But the entirety of our business is driven through core data sourced out of that identity system of record. Other thoughts, comments?
Oh, yeah.
Sorry, bright lights. Go.
Oh, yeah, thanks. We've talked a lot about identity management, but I wonder about identity governance and how you might be thinking about how does that tie to data governance? Because in our institution, data governance is managed out of the provost office. And we don't really have much in terms of identity governance right now. We're really thinking about it from a tactical and technical issue. So just wanted to hear thoughts about that.
Sure.
Sorry, I missed most of that. Could you repeat the question?
Sure. So I think the question was fundamentally around, I think you said you had data governance. It's in the provost office. It's a relatively functional, as much as anybody's data governance, is a relatively functional operation. But identity governance right now is more tactical and operational, and it's not sort of governed at that institutional level in the same way. And do any of us have any sort of solutions or space?
Yes.
So we're just working through our own data governance effort. And I guess I would say that we've, with leadership support, deans, vice presidents, et cetera, declared that there's a new era for data governance. So we are essentially, what we've had is a very distributed approach historically, with lots of people who believe they own decision rights over who can have access to what data. And we have begun the process of resetting those roles so that there are fewer Mother May I journeys to a dozen places to get access to data. So I think that that's right. And the other piece I'll say in the data governance side is I largely by fiat have said now that all enterprise data will be in the data warehouse, period. If you don't want to have your systems data in the enterprise data warehouse or available there, since we don't copy it all anymore, then the bad news is you can't have that system, because we can't be in a situation anymore where that data is not enterprise accessible. So this has been widely supported because there's been so much institutional pain around access to data and getting answers to important questions that leadership is completely aligned. Our next phase is working this through the middle of the organization. You know, the top tier we need to support, the folks who do the day-to-day work aren't that invested in this set of things. It's the middle that has seen this as a mechanism of control that I think we have to socialize through.
Yeah, and I'd share that our journey is somewhat similar to yours. I think we've done reasonable work on the data governance side. Identity governance really isn't a concept that's fully accepted. It used to be, oh, we need this attribute to spin up this application. And that decision-making would run back to IT, but everybody would want to own their own component. I think as an industry, we're not as mature on the governance around identity as we need to be. And then I think there's a question back to that stewardship. Like in our campus, all the data is the chancellor's, research data is VCRE's office, academic data is provost office. But whose is identity data? Like, I can tell you my current chancellor is going to say, it's probably your data, man, like, figure it out. But we don't have the governance processes to support that right now. And so I think that's an emergent area. I know it's conversations we're having, whether it's through tools, platforms, and workflows, or just that ownership governance conversation. Albert.
Can I just,
sorry,
can I just
Lois,
add to
and then
this
Albert.
really quickly? I think in this conversation, it's important to separate the what from the how.
Yes,
And the what, that this employee needs access to this data for business reasons is handled by the business offices, and we are lucky to have good data governance in place, always evolving, but a good structure in place. Separate that from the how. Now that you've made that decision that this person should get this data, how are we going to assert that? How are we going to assure that it stays correct? How are we going to make sure the data is handled correctly? That's an area that we in IT can assert for the university, working with our partners to say, that's a great idea. This is how we're actually going to execute it in a reliable, sustainable, repeatable way that meets our standards. And as part of that, then, our team becomes deeply involved with the people that are making some of the what decisions, really helping them navigate some of the complexities and get to some good decisions once they know what's actually possible. And again, back to our bird's eye view, kind of how the decisions they make are going to manifest themselves beyond the first use case that might be being discussed.
And I'll completely agree, so much so that my biggest growth area in staff right now is in business analysts. Because we're being asked to be a partner to the business in everything.
Right.
We need to make it work, which means we need to understand the process, which is not what I would have thought if you'd asked me that 5 years ago. Like, I would have been, oh, I'm spending more money on security, more money on identity, more money on networks. Business analysts is our biggest growth area, and consequently, we're growing the project management because of the number of projects that are coming from the business analysts.
Yeah.
Albert.
So I was going to ask a very similar question. So I'm really glad we already are here. So I'll continue on, right? So given we have this need to develop this notion that identity management is really I'll call it more of a business function, right? It's as much of a business function as it is a system function. Two-part questions. How do we, number one, change that conversation, right? We come to TechX, we come to Community Exchange. Whether we notice it or not, we refer to identity management as a systems problem, right? How do we change the conversation, number one? Number two, what can InCommon do, especially relative to what we're about to embark on in InCommon Futures?
So again, I'm having a little trouble with the echo in the room off the ceiling. Can you?
Okay,
Sorry.
sure. Albert, I'll let you go, because I get the first half, but not the second half. So
Okay, first half, right? Given that we all acknowledge identity management is as much a business function and data, call it data hygiene issues, as much as a systems issue, right? Part one, how do we change that conversation? Because up until this point, when we gather as a community, conscious or not, we discuss identity management as a systems problem, right? How do we shift the conversation? Number two, what can InCommon do to help relative to InCommon Futures priorities?
Perfect. I caught the futures, but that was all. So thank you. Who wants to take a pass at that? That's not a loaded question and a hard one. Anybody want to take a pass at that one? I certainly have thoughts, but go
So
for it.
I'll say maybe two quick things. I think for us, that transition has already happened. So we already talk about it largely as a business problem that has systems implications. Lois, you kind of pointed to this. That's where we start from. And so I think that piece is a transition we've been through and is just the way that we talk and work on it. I think on the in common side, from my perspective, I would say that my perception is that in common has been very technically focused in the sets of tools and things that it's produced, and it needs to extend out and focus a little bit more on some of those other dimensions of need and application that we have in identity.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree, Albert, that I think that's the pivot we need to make. And quite honestly, pick on my fellow CIOs. Right now, it's a CIO's problem to make sure the enterprise understands it's a business problem, not a systems problem. That's case making, relationship building, why this matters, storytelling, risk management. That's what the CIO is supposed to be doing. Not alone, in partnership with their IDM team and everybody else, but that's a political case, a business case, and quite honestly, a risk case that has to be made. To the second part, I completely agree with Chris. I think collectively as an industry, we depend profoundly on the technical tools that have come from this community, with Internet 2 support, with the community support, and that's important, and that's substrate. But if we can't raise that conversation to be a business conversation, an outcomes conversation, I worry we're going to either become less dependent on those platforms or have other platforms emerge in vended spaces that are going to supplant those. So I think we have to collectively think, is this just a technical problem or a business problem? I think the business problem is what we have to start focusing our conversations on. And that's going to involve different skill sets.
I will also add, just in case for those of you who were not in the Microsoft presentation earlier, and I'm going to assume Corey speaks for the entire vendor space, right? Corey is from Microsoft. He actually pointed out the need for us to develop that discipline, right? His perspective is we supply tools, i.e. Microsoft, but we need help developing that business and just, I'll call it process maturity.
Completely agree. And for those of you who didn't see the Microsoft talk, hopefully you'll get slides or something else. But I was teasing one of our friends from Internet too. Like, the talk was brilliant, but it was labeled Microsoft Multilateral Federation. Like, I knew what that was, but I've been doing this for too long. Like, it's the business issue. And Corey is brilliant. But we need to engage with that community. We need to find our partners, find our allies, engage in the business part of that. And if Steve is here from Arkansas. Oh, there you bright light, sorry, man. Talk to him, he rocked it. Others?
So I see a cultural change at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and I don't get any credit for it because it started before I got there. But we started doing significant training and awareness around cybersecurity and the reasons we do it with a real business focus. And people come to me all the time and they quote that training back to me. And they don't only quote it back to me, they live it. It's a big part of their lives and their business life. So, and both, like we see it in their personal lives too. The woman was like, I got this and I knew it was trash. I knew it was fraud, so I just deleted it, and of course we love hearing those stories. So, so we see that happening, which is going to frame that business discussion really well. And it gives us a vocabulary to talk to people with. And then I was in a funding advisory board meeting and they said, you know what we don't know much about? We don't know much about identity. And, because identity is their net ID and maybe the password, maybe MFA, it's a very simple picture for them. And that was a real wake-up call for me. So how do I talk about identity to the business owners, to the end users in those business offices, to the researchers, so that it makes sense and it looks cohesive, but they get a sense of all that it encompasses.
And to that end, we have had similar experiences, so much so that we actually went out and hired a communications engagement person to meet with our campus community to say, us IT people do not explain this well, right? We cause our own grief. How can we talk about this in human terms, in business function terms, in outcome terms? That changed our dialogue on campus. That changed the change resistance to when we have to do platform and system changes, because it's actually generally not the platforms and the systems. Frequently, it's the business processes that are enabled by these systems that we have to engage. And we don't own most of those business processes. So it's, again, us pivoting as change agents on campus for the business, not just IT.
You know, I think the storytelling is so important. I was just laughing when you talk about that. We have many people in our organization, our IT organization, who are really good at talking to people about things. And we have a sense of who the right person is to have in the room at any given time. I spend a lot of time talking to university leadership, contextualizing things for into their business terms. Many others do that in the organization. We also do have a communications team, and they lead the way when we're doing kind of mass communications, training or change communications. And they've adopted a practice called plain language. I think of it as the de-geek filter that happens. But, you know, thinking about how we explain things, you know, we've actually been pretty fortunate at Wisconsin-Madison. I will say we're fortunate because we're at a university that has been financially stable, but getting money for initiatives that include IT initiatives. And all of that is contextualizing what needs to happen in the terms of the academic outcomes, the business outcomes that the university needs. We all know that the operations of the university rest on our shoulders and that all roads lead to identity. But being able to explain that in a way that isn't all about us, that's about what's going to happen to our faculty, to our students because of these investments, is then really key to the equation of getting the kind of support we need.
Great. Others?
And I'll just build on that. I think the pandemic was a tremendous help for us in this because, you know, I gave a presentation afterward where I said basically we didn't know who worked here, we didn't know who studied here, we didn't know why people were here, if they showed up here. And so I think that brought this problem home for people in a way that was incredibly powerful and hangs on to this day. And it was an object lesson in really translating this to the business needs, business language of the community.
Great. Other questions? Keith. Oh, Albert's got you, Keith.
I'm sorry. I'm just throwing off the whole system here.
Go for it, man.
My question's going to be quicker than the amount of time it took me to get to the microphone. Digital wallets, what do they mean to you? How do you think they're going to impact your institution? And what are you going to do about it?
Great question. I will tell you step one, I don't know. This is why we're fortunate to have smart people like you. I mean, let me abstract that away though as opposed to the flip answer. Like, credentials are at the heart of everything we do, right? Digital wallet being a manifestation of credential processing, forwarding, engagement, persistence, transitiveness, that's core to our business, right? And if you abstract it away from identity, as universities, yes, we do research, yes, we do the other stuff, but most of us earn our bread and butter by giving people credential in the form of a degree, right? We've been in the identity business for 400 years, well, in the US, 400 years, no offense to my European colleagues who have been doing this a lot longer than we have. Right? Digital wallets are just an extension and a manifestation of that same thing. This is core to what we do. We're about credentialing people for future success far beyond our walls. I think digital wallets presents interesting opportunities and challenges, and I will be the first to say, I don't know what all of those are. I'll have a side conversation with Klaus somewhere along the line because I know I'm uninformed, and that's a problem. If I've been in this identity community for that long and I don't know it, I don't know how CIOs who haven't been in this community know where we are in position with that.
That sums it up.
And I'll just say more checks to write to more people that we have to get services from in order to make use of it. Yeah.
Great.
And I look forward to working on that problem with you, Keith.
Paul Erickson, Moran. Okay, so bringing it back around to future-proofing identity. You've talked a lot about, you know, the staffing challenges and the crunch on the identity team because the identity team is really kind of the one place in the IT organization that's most focused on that interplay between the business and the technology and how those fit together. And that's really kind of future-proofing, you know, where IT needs to evolve to. So I guess what I'm wondering is, how does this look as kind of a harbinger for reimagining the IT organization to take some of the pressure off and better reflect what the needs of the campus are, you know, in light of what you're seeing in the identity space?
Yeah.
Summarize the question for me again.
Sure. So I think the question's about the changes coming in the identity space with respect to staffing and everything else. How is that a harbinger of the bigger changes to come? Is the sort of essence of it. I mean, what I'll say, and it comes back to when I answered a little bit previously, I think the role of an IT organization is fundamentally pivoting within higher ed as an industry to be a core business partner. Many of us have been moved to whatever cabinet level, executive positions we can be. But what I've observed, I've been in this role full-time for 5 years. I've seen a change even in those 5 years. It used to be like, oh, we have to check with IT to make sure we're not doing anything stupid, to before we do this thing, let's figure out how much this might cost us. And I think a couple of Salesforce bills got people motivated about that. I think that's at the core. I think we have to be at that table. It has to be identity as a first-rate system. It has to be IT as a core business partner, which means aligning with the business goals and objectives. I spend much more time with the provost and the VC of research now than I do with my direct reports. And that's probably healthy. But who's going to run the IT organization? I think it's going to cause a sort of structural change in how we're doing things. But I think that's the core to what it is. And I think it's recognizing IT's more prominent role, but also having us as IT recognizing that we can't just focus on systems and platforms. We have to focus on the business.
You know, and as we've become more visible and more pivotal to the university and what they want to accomplish, and particularly coming out of the pandemic, where it really brought IT to the visible forefront, we need to think about that and how we kind of sustain and nurture the organization so it continues on this path of excellence. Just one quick thought following up. Any of us who have been doing this longer than a year have had to learn new skills along the way. And so how do we then think about create an organizational space for people to continually learn new skills, have time to experiment, have time to kind of think about what's coming and what's next? You know, it's a challenge because we're busy, but we've got to create a space where our staff can continue to stay abreast of new ideas and experiment with new ideas, because many of them will come into the solutions for next year or 5 years down the road.
Yeah.
It's interesting too, because we talked a little bit at the beginning about the sort of procurement pipelines. And one of the things we've been trying to figure out how to describe to our campus is what needs IT review. And I think we've come up with a relatively simple rule, and that is, does it have a cord or a battery? Because if it does, it probably needs IT review as part of the process, right? Because it means there's a computer in it and all that downstream implication. But it's interesting because I think it's brought to people's consciousness, and I think you mentioned the data pieces. A lot of our units can't really make decisions about what data should go where anymore without consulting with us, because they don't understand whether it's regulatory implications, the privacy implications. And so I think that the depth of engagement in the business, we've always sort of said we're involved in everything, but the reality is you really can't do much of anything without having us at the table and us engaged, at least not without incurring a lot more risk than you really want.
And Lois, I want to follow up on your point because I agree, you know, all of us are in so much transactional work. Everything's a short demand cycle, but we all have to learn new skills. That's a resource case making issue, but it's also a executive prioritization that we need to make this time and be like, you know what, this is what's going to happen when we operate at 95% staff, so I'm keeping 5% staff time just for training so we don't end up further back down the chain.
What, if any, changes do you see in identity management in the quantum world that's coming?
I'm sorry, in the what world?
Quantum.
Quantum world.
I'm sure there'll be some, and once somebody actually gets a quantum network that operates more than 10 kilometers, I'll worry about it more. I mean, the reality is my worry there, from a quantum perspective, is going to be more risks to PKI infrastructures through traditional public key. What does that mean? You know, does ECC save us? Not. That's more what I'm thinking about, but right now, that's not top of mind. It will become top of mind in a heartbeat, I'm sure. But quantum is one of those things I spend lots of time talking with our VCRE office and the state and everybody else trying to figure out how they're going to get some federal money for this, and nobody knows how to do it.
And will we be, I'm just speculating, will we be pressured to move identity and security and some other things out of the way to let quantum do its full quantumness?
Right? Yeah.
Am I in the box or not?
You're in, exactly. You're in the box and not.
Just a quick thing that I want to just confirm, Chris, because the way you said one thing, some people could leave here thinking that you are affirming that the only way to really move forward in identity is to buy a new commercial system.
No, I'm sorry if I said that. This is my problem with moving
You
too
talked about
quickly.
investment of funds or procuring
Yeah.
things, and I just wanted
Yeah,
to.
no. It's going to be unique to the institution how they can fund it. What I'm saying for me, and again, maybe it's because I've spent too much time in executive chair, there are a lot of things, I'll tell a story the other way. I used to have a farm. I used to raise chickens. It was wonderful. I never slaughtered a chicken. I went to the grocery store to buy chicken because I had no interest in getting that amount of blood on my hands. As an industry, I think sometimes we like to raise the chicken from the ground up and build the software and everything else, but there's sometimes I'd rather just buy the chicken from the supermarket. That's what I was getting at, is I think there's components, there's aspects, and I think part of the trick we're going to have is figuring out what are those things that are positively business differentiating, or not solved by a vendor community, or preserving us from losing control by going to one of the big three providers. I think that's where the real trick is, and I think there is a component of vended solutions, but no. I happily maintain a contract with Google and Microsoft for Workspace and Office 365, and I tell them both, this is intentional, because I don't trust either of you. And I like my friends at Google and Microsoft, but that's the positioning I've had to take, so that's really what I'm getting at.
And I might tie that to Alfred's question earlier. I think for one of the things that I'd like to see InCommon do is step into more of this space, where we did a lot more locally. We did local development of software, and I was pushing Kevin a little bit on this earlier today. I'd like to see, and I'm willing to spend more money with InCommon to get there. I'd like to see more productized versions of some of the packages that are out there that are more accessible. I'd like to see as a service out of InCommon for some of these things, because this is a community that I can have trust in. No disrespect to vendors, we have great vendors and partners, but they have a different set of interests, right? Our incentives within the community, I think, are 100% aligned, whereas with vendors, they're not ever going to be 100% aligned. That's not necessarily a bad thing, that's just a fact of how things are structured. So I think it would be, I think it's incumbent on us as a community to really push that. And Kevin did a good presentation earlier about InCommon Futures. And I think that we need to be willing to step forward with resources, time investment, and sort of business description of what it is that we need to achieve in order to get to that outcome. I'd like to see a lot more on the community front, both as a hedge against the commercial side, and also because in reality, whether it's Microsoft or Google or SailPoint or Okta or any of these others, they don't actually solve the collection of problems that I have in its entirety.
Agree completely. We are at time. I'm getting away from Gene, so thank you so much. Again, I love doing things like this because this is hanging out with smart people and getting good questions. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And thank you to this panelists.